Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Counterculture Media Podcast. My name is Alex Anderson. I'm your host, and today I am joined by the rad-tacular Indigo Wolff. Hello, Indigo. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you, Alex?
I'm doing pretty good. I have White Claw. It is Saturday night, and it's almost Christmas, and I'm very happy.
Nice.
Yeah.
And it is Saturday night and it's almost Christmas, and I have my tequila hot chocolate. Shout out to Erica Hessian for that tequila infusion.
What did she infuse it with?
I think it's cocoa and coffee, technically. So, like, it's a mocha hot chocolate.
Okay. And so the tequila is fused with
Yeah.
more chocolatey and coffee-y flavors?
Yes. Into my hot chocolate. Because I
Okay.
just like to mix all my uppers and downers together.
I mean, that's like why a vodka Red Bull is one of the best drinks ever to get at a bar, because it's like, you know what? I want to fuck up the dance floor and fuck up my brain cells.
Yes. You know who's gonna get shit coming to them? The dance floor and my liver.
They're both gonna get it.
Yeah.
All right. So today we are going to revisit, because we had recorded previously and I messed around with the sound settings too much and it sounded horrible. So we're going to be talking about the same thing and pretending like we haven't already.
Great. I have forgotten most of that conversation, so I'm already on a good track.
All right, good. Me too. So yeah, it's been a couple weeks. I drank a few times since then, so I'm ready to go. And
Yeah.
I'd like to start off with the same way I started off last time, because we did have a really awesome conversation, but we're talking about fat culture and fat activism. And I still feel, even after our conversation, I still feel like it's just a very difficult thing to talk about, because it's just, to me, I'm like all about being kind and stuff, and it's really hard for me to say things like my fat friend, even though it is technically okay to say.
Hmm. Yeah. So that is like the first thing that a lot of people jump into is how do we talk about this and do we use the word fat? And I think that that's a really interesting conversation because of how we as a society have changed. So the first, it's almost easier to start at the beginning on how we define fatty, that if you were fat, that was seen as like a socially good thing because it meant that you could afford meat. And like we're talking about like the dark ages kind of. And and through the Renaissance. And Rubenesque, the painter, the famous Renaissance painter Rubens painted fatter ladies. And it's not until kind of recently that fat actually became a negative thing. And a lot of people don't know this, but it was actually around World War One and Two, where they started having to ration a lot of materials and a lot of food for the wars. And then suddenly, if you were fat, you were considered as like taking all of these resources away from our troops and all this other stuff. And kind of as a result of that, it became this huge social taboo to be larger. And it's targeted a lot towards women because at the time men were the ones who were soldiers, and so fat women were especially bad because they couldn't even be soldiers. So now you can't be a soldier and you're taking those resources. Um, and since then, the idea of the word fat has become synonymous with bad. I hate. And when I use the word fat, I'm only using it as a descriptor. And I've had to have this conversation with a lot of people. Of I see myself as fat. I take that term proudly. And for me, it just describes my body. It doesn't talk about my who I am as a person or the choices I've made or my willpower. It's just that there is more fat on my body than someone who is straight sized, and there's even a lot of debate around what constitutes fat, and so I tend to go for my definition of fat, which is if you can walk into a regular store and know that you will find clothing that fits you comfortably, then you are probably not the type of fat that I advocate for. If you have to go to a specialty store like Torrid, Lane Bryant, XL Min, etc., and that is where you have to go for clothing because you probably won't find something in a Walmart Target, then you are the fat that I advocate for.
Okay. Because there's definitely right now, especially with COVID time, gyms being closed and all that, everybody is putting on extra weight, but it's not necessarily that they're joining the fat class. I don't know. It's like everybody is putting on extra pounds, but it's like they're new fat, and like the way people talk about their bodies in this like ashamed sort of way, like I have gained weight because of COVID, because of my lack of regular activity that I'm used to. Is that sort of
Mm-hmm.
problematic because it's people trying to say that they are, I don't know, like yeah, like it's one of those things where it's just like I have a lot to learn about this subject. Like so yeah, like new fat. Like I'm the fattest I've ever been in my life right now. And but I still I don't know. Like I don't consider myself fat though. I don't know. Like where in is am I trying to make a point here?
I think what you're getting at that you don't quite realize what you're getting at is around fat advocacy. It's very similar in some ways to disability advocacy because not everybody is disabled, but everybody has the potential to be. Like you can always lose a limb or some other thing could happen to you that would make you disabled. And being fat is kind of the same thing, where not everybody is fat, but anybody could be fat. And how do we address that, especially when there are a bunch of different societal norms around it, and how are we defining things? And the first thing that I want to say to anybody who's listening is if you have gained weight during COVID, that's totally understandable. It is a normal stress response. So please don't panic. You're going to be fine. And even if the weight never goes away, you are still going to be fine because folks like me are advocating for you to be fine. Um, so then we have to talk about fat in terms of not just how people are right now, but almost on like a chronological spectrum of people who maybe were fat and have lost weight, and people who weren't fat and now have gained weight and are fat, which changes a lot of the dynamics of how people might operate. Um, and I think that that's still something that's being explored even in the fat community. And a lot of folks who are fat advocates don't know how to address that still, and like how to welcome new people in a way that is productive. Because someone like me who has been fat all of their life has had to deal with the oppression of being fat in every situation up to this point, whereas someone else is now in terms of they have gained weight during the pandemic just like everybody else, so now they are seen as more acceptable than someone like me who has been fat my whole life. And so navigating those dynamics is hard. And I think that the best thing that I can do is acknowledge it comes back to privilege in most cases. You have to acknowledge where you have had privilege and where you haven't. And then privilege is a thing. Even if you don't have it now, you could have had it in the past, and vice versa.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So it's just very much like I don't know. And are people? And that's the thing. Like, it's people still see it as such like a negative connotation. Like fat is synonymous with bad. So it's like is it hard to welcome people into fat culture and fat activism, especially if they have like this mindset of just like, oh no no no, like I'm temporarily fat. Oh no no no, like I don't want my body to be like this. Like are they those aren't people who like, I don't know, you want to stick up for because they're assholes about it, right?
That's it's that is a really tough question, and I lean towards being as gracious as possible and welcoming anybody who needs to be welcomed. And I will, even if someone is fat and fat phobic and has that internalized fat phobia, I'm still advocating for them. I still think that they should have the same quality of life as anybody else,
Mhm.
because I don't think that the size actually matters to that. Um, and so it's one of those things where it is hard to have those conversations with folks who are newly fat, for the lack of a better way to describe that, because they do see themselves as being suddenly very unhealthy, or they are really like unhappy with their bodies, and that can be a really hard conversation because if you hate yourself, I know that you probably hate me too because I'm not only fat, but I'm not trying to change that.
Yeah.
And so this kind of comes into the idea of the acceptable fat person layer of like people who gained weight during COVID but aren't otherwise fat are seen as acceptably fat. And also tying into that is a fat person who's constantly trying to lose weight, or a fat person who is appropriately proportioned is pretty common. So we see a lot of like BBWs, which is short for big beautiful women, and they just happen to have like small boobs or they have really big boobs and like no hips, and those are seen as not acceptable types of fat as well, just because they aren't an ideal look. And so it's this idea that like it's okay to be fat, but only if you perform these certain things for thin people to feel comfortable around you.
Yeah, and I feel like there's a gigantic double standard there too, because like right now, like dad bods are in, and it's like, oh, okay, well, it's like it's okay for dudes to have a little bit of extra weight. It's actually seen as attractive, which I think is like a straight up like patriarchal fucking move in and of itself, where it's just like, yeah, it's fine for us, but ladies, you got to make sure that you know, stay trim. And there's a huge double standard, I feel like, when
Yeah.
it comes to like fat activism and fat culture. Do you agree?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I definitely agree. I think that even in the ways that we portray fat folks, like the ones that I always think of are cartoons specifically, because we look at like standard American families, and the things that I always think of are The Simpsons and Family Guy, which are two fat men who have who I said that wrong. They're two fat men who married very traditionally attractive wives. And that is seen as normal and desirable, and they aren't seen as an enemy except by antagonists in the story. Like that happens occasionally, but it's not really something that we address that way. Whereas that almost never happens in reverse. And if it does, it is almost always the butt of a joke, um, which is really tough. And I think that there are some ways that that is very unfortunate because one of the other things, what is seen as a backslide, then we also attack them, and that is true for men as well. And the example that I always think of is Jason Momoa, who I will never be as fit as, and most people in this country will never be as fit as. At one point, was seen exiting, a store or something, and he happened to not be dehydrated, and so you did not see his six-pack ab. He instead had like a normal stomach, and that was seen as totally because Aquaman, which I think had been his like most recent film, he had absolutely dehydrated himself to show all of those muscles, which is the only way you can show those muscles that consistently is you are either 0% body fat, which is very hard to maintain, or you are incredibly dehydrated, or both. So I think that ass in a lot of ways, because it means that you must be pristine at all times, and there's no room for negotiation or wiggle room or
Yeah.
jiggle room.
I like that. Yeah,
Thanks.
it's like the I don't know. It's something we talk about, like everybody talks about constantly, but it just seems like it's something that people don't really fucking actually people like it, people will recognize like yeah, like beauty standards are ridiculous. Like body standards are ridiculous and almost impossible to manage, but at the same time it's like everybody still has these as the ideals of what's like a body should be. And do you, and I think a lot of this comes from like diet culture, because diet culture is straight up like a cult that wants your money.
Yes. Yeah, I think that diet culture is really the one of the pinnacle achievements of capitalism. And I want to like give that statement some context in that I am very anti-capitalist and anti-capitalism as a social construct. Um, Very pro-commerce, very anti-capitalism, and there's a very specific difference there. Um, but I think that diet culture is one of those situations where you can just make money hand over fist, because as a society we are constantly drifting from one beauty standard to another, and it changes every year, which is why we have like out of season clothing, which what does that even mean? Like, it's clothing, just put it on your body so that you're not showing off your genitals all the time. It's not hard. um, but it continues with diet culture because if you manage to lose a lot of weight, the percentage of people who manage to keep that weight off is very low. So if you do lose that weight, you will probably gain it back, which means that you will spend more money losing it again, because it worked for you once. Why wouldn't it work again? And in that same belief that you can just change your body, which is not true. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of luck to change your body, and there are so many things that go into being fat that have nothing to do with the decisions that people make. But because we see it as a moral failing and something that we can change, we're just not doing enough to change it. It's one of those things that diet culture continuously perpetuates itself. Um, and so, yeah, I really think that it's like the biggest trick, because in addition to all of the things that I just said, diet culture works against a system that has been created over eons of evolution to help keep fat on our bodies. This is what our bodies want. They want that storage of energy and fat and warmth and insulation, and we're just trying to like go against all of that. And it's supposed to be easy, by most people's thinking, which it's really not. So you have to, you're pitting, basically what it is the diet culture pits us against ourselves, and the only option is to lose most of the time.
Man, that's so fucked up.
Yeah.
Capitalism is just so good at what it does. It's like it's awful. It's scary. Uh,
It
but
really is.
but yeah, it's I don't know. It sucks. Like just learning. I've been like I listened to a lot of podcasts leading up to our interview the first time, and then a few in between. Sophie Hagen is awesome. They are a non-binary fat activist, also comedian, model, podcaster, like, and
Yeah.
they just have a lot to say. As like those are my two big sources if people want to like learn more. Is like go listen to her, and also or follow your fat friend. That's somebody that you introduced me to, and it's just like it's just one of those things that like I don't know. I don't really think about. I'm privileged to be like a fucking white dude who's like, yeah, I'm fat, whatever. But it's like, it's really eye-opening to see just how fucking awful people are to fat people. Like it's shocking to me because I don't have a mean bone in my body, but just like hearing all these fucking horror stories of just fat people just have it like so rough. They just get like verbally abused, and it's just I hate it. Like, and that's why I feel it's really
Yeah.
important to like
And
talk
that,
about
I think,
activism. Sorry, go ahead.
oh, no worries. Because I agree, we should be talking about it. But I think that that gets the reason why fat folks are so abused is because it's not only easy to do, like, not only are we easy targets, but it's seen as justified by the majority of people. And it's not even justified from a place of, I'm trying to figure out how to say this. It's not even justified in a way that doesn't make sense. It is supposedly justified because there is, and I use this term very broadly, science behind it, which is one of those things that people are like, well, I've looked into, I know that being fat is unhealthy for all of these reasons, and science has proved it, and dietitians and nutritionists and doctors and all these people say that it's really bad. But if you dig a little bit deeper into the science around fatness, it does begin to fall apart. But most people don't dig that deep, and so they feel justified in saying, well, we can abuse you trying to get you to lose weight, and then it gets marketed as tough love and all kinds of other things that are just super inaccurate. And in addition to having justified that, it means that it's so much harder to call them out because they feel like they're on a logical path. And on the surface, it does seem like a logical path because of all of that fake science. Um, but just to like really dive into some of the science that is out there that nobody talks about, um, one study found that if you control for the stress of fat phobia, so if you take out all the stress factors that have to do with like money, which we'll go into a fat tax later, we'll go into that. But like how much money you have to spend as a fat person and how much abuse you get and how much stress from yo-yo dieting, et cetera, puts on your body. If you remove all of those factors, fat folks actually die at around the same age and rate as folks who aren't fat. Um, and in addition to that, you find that folks who are underweight and stress factors, folks who are underweight according to the BMI, which we will also go into, um, the folks who are underweight are more likely to die at younger ages than folks who are fat. In addition to that, there is science that says cis men are more likely to die when they are fat than women if you're not controlling for stress factors. Um, and so all of this kind of negates what people say about being fat, that it is just inherently unhealthy. In addition to that, there's all kinds of things that go against common nutritional facts. Like people always say that salt is really bad for your blood pressure, but they have recently debunked those studies that said that. And a lot of those studies, we didn't even know that fact until the 50s. And I use the word no very generously there because I believe it was Eisenhower had a heart attack, and there were doctors that did quote unquote studies around it and found that salt was one of the factors. But if you look at those studies, that's all junk science. Even the doctors, I believe, who performed those studies had admitted it at some point. Wrong. By which I mean, do fact check me, but I'm sorry if I'm wrong. But it's just not good science anymore. And we don't want to accept that as a culture for some reason because we don't look at negating things like negating science, and that's a whole issue in the community of research and study that is also in the middle of being trying to be fixed. But it does come back to capitalism because it is hard to fund studies that negate theories.
Yeah. And I gotta say, then you told me that the first time we did this, that salt isn't necessarily terrible for you. Like I was so excited about that. I haven't fact checked
Yeah.
it yet because I don't want it to not be true. But I've just been like one of my favorite snacks is a Granny Smith apple with salt on it, and I've just been dumping salt all the fuck over it. It's been great.
Nice.
And
Yeah.
yeah, it's I don't
Yeah.
know.
And
Sorry.
well, I was going to also say that it's one of those things that, like, people also don't want. We as a society are really obsessed with all of these, like, empirical facts that can't be disproven and things like that, which is not how science works. There is no absolutely proven fact. There is just facts that are more supported by studies and facts that are less supported. And one of the things that I always like, I do want to drive people towards science because it's very important, but you also do have to be skeptical, and that's in the spirit of science.
Yeah.
And we always want to think that as a society, we have these hard facts that can be attributed to everybody, but everybody is different. And there are some people who they have sweets or they eat a lot of salt and they feel really icky the next day and, you know, a little bit sluggish. And you know your body better than other people. If your snack of a Granny Smith apple and salt on it invigorates you, you should totally eat that. And just like for me, one of the snacks that I always go towards is Cheez Its. I love Cheez Its, and I know my limit on eating them. There will be a point where I feel icky because I've eaten, like, you know, a whole box, which is not ideal for my body, and I know that. But, and this comes back to a whole nother thing about being fat that I always tell people who are like, well, you're not, you know, with health and everything like that, is even if it is unhealthy, I am allowed to make this choice and you still have to respect me as a person. And this really ties into a lot of the advocacy that I'm trying to perpetuate the most, which is regardless of whether or not fat is a choice, regardless if it has anything to do with willpower, it is not at all a factor in health. And being healthy is absolutely not a factor in your moral standing in the world or in your morals at all. Health is not the pinnacle of being a good person. And this, I feel, is really important to drive home because it just emphasizes that I have body autonomy. Even if I'm making the choice to be fat every day and I wake up and I'm like, I'm going to eat all, you know, I'm going to eat all the things that make me fat. I'm never going to exercise or whatever. You still have to respect me as a person. You don't get to abuse me. You should not get to charge me more money. And the world should make space for me because I exist.
Yeah, like whether or not like we should also talk about like the health aspect of it, but you're right. It's one of those things like whether or not like because there's a lot of like there's thyroid issues, there's different body types. Like some people are just fat and that's just okay. And I feel like it's one of the only things that can be quote unquote unhealthy and have someone judge you for it, which is fucked up. Just like it's not like, God damn it, Richard, you have polio. Like nobody's ever gonna say that shit. But we should we should talk about like because this has actually become like a huge theme on my podcast is like what is health, because it's your physical well-being is health, but it's also like uh a lot of his mental health and like all these factors come into play, like because there's eating disorders. There's also like it'd be hyperthyroid or would be hypothyroid, correct?
Mhm.
Anybody?
Hypothyroid is usually underactive, so you gain more weight, and hyper is the reverse.
Gotcha. But yeah, there's just like there's all these things that don't really have to do like some of it is like the health aspect of it, but some of it just absolutely has nothing to do with health. Like I was talking about the meme I saw with you last time we talked where it's like y'all be making fun of fat people, but you think that like the girl who's 90 pounds and fucking smokes a pack of cigarettes a day and fucking does rails of Xanax is healthier, you know? Like
Right.
physical appearance is not an indication of health.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of those things. So like you said it, but I'm going to re-emphasize it. Is like, how do we even define health? Do we define health by muscle mass? So like people who are stronger are inherently more healthy, which means that I'm one of the healthiest people I know because I have to haul around my body all day, and there's a lot here. Like versus like I'll never be as healthy as a bodybuilder because they can lift way more than I can. So is that health, or is health have to do with like organ functioning? Because if someone has Crohn's disease, they'll never ever be healthy. Um, or do we use it as like an energy level, because people who have narcolepsy, depression, or any other types of issues, they'll never be healthy by that definition. So you have to decide what health means kind of on your own, and that is what fat folks have done for years. And that was one of the things for me coming into the community, was figuring out that healthy has to be kind of defined by yourself and how you feel, because you're going to have to advocate for it. And just as an example, since the last time we talked about this, I had a visit with my doctor who said, well, you should just lose weight. You should lose about 100 pounds and it'll be easy for you because you're young. And I was like, well, first of all, I have been trying to lose weight since I was 8. And then I stopped at the age of 16 because I was just done trying to worry about it. Second of all, age doesn't have that much to do with it. So I'm not even going to go into that. But like, what makes you think that this is suddenly going to be the time? Like, what makes you think I made the choice to be unhealthy if it is a choice that I made? Which means that what makes you think I can reverse it, since it's not a choice that I made in the first time, in the first place? Um, and like, on top of that, a lot of providers have done that to me, where they're like, well, you just need to lose weight and then that's it. And then they send me out the door, and I'm like, well, you didn't provide any type of exercise routine. You didn't provide me mental health support. You haven't given me any money to buy more vegetables. What are all these things? Like, how am I supposed to lose weight if I don't have any access to any of the things you think will make me lose weight? Um, and on top of that, my body is not a body that loses weight very easily, if at all. To the point that I remember exactly one incident of me ever losing weight, and that is, there was a winter that I was really unhappy with my body, and I didn't eat. Every time I felt hungry, I would drink a glass of water and I would play an exercise video game. And then I would have one dinner every day that ended up being about 500 calories. So for a solid week and a half, I ended up having something like, when I did the math, it was like 7,500 calories for a week and a half, which is not at all a healthy amount of calories for someone to have. But everyone said that I looked great the next week. I saw people again and they were like, oh, you lost weight, you look great. And I was not only tired all the time, but I was cold all the time. I was really even more unhappy. I was not sleeping well. And then my appetite was messed up for like a solid 2 months afterwards because my hormones went all out of choices that I made. And it was just one of those things that really proved to me, I was like, I never will lose weight, and I just have to be okay with that. And so does everybody else at this
Yeah.
point.
And if I feel like the big part about like fighting fat phobia and the whole and fat activism is like, because from what I hear from like all the sources that I hear is just like people who are fat and happy with it, and it's just like, well, yeah, this is dope. Like, I don't need anybody to tell me like what my bodily autonomy means to them, because it only matters to me. But a lot of it is just come into like, well, now that I feel this like sense of joy, just like having my own body and just being cool with it, like, it doesn't mean that there's not stuff to fight for, because people are just, like I said, people are just dicks. Like, I don't know. And
Yep.
I'm passionate about this because just like, yeah, go listen to Sophie Hagen, and she has my fat friend on, or your fat friend on her podcast, like anonymously, of course, but just hearing these stories, it's just like, man, there's just so much to do, because you're
Mhm.
right. It's one of those things where it's just like, I don't know, nobody's cool with racial slurs. Nobody's cool with all these like other terrible things that are saying to people. But for some reason, it's just like people can whisper behind fat people's backs and just be like, like, I really worry for them. Like, I really wish they would get their lives under control. And just like hearing it now, just like fucking infuriates me. Like, well, so what are the things you
Yep.
can do to fight fat phobia and to help fat activism?
I think the first thing comes down to knowing science. It like look into the BMI and look at how many people have really debunked it. And if you're listening and you don't know what BMI is, you've been under a rock, and I'm very impressed. Um, and it stands for Body Mass Index, and really used in like every doctor's office still, because it's supposed to have this weight range that is healthy. Um, and it is based on statistics from, I think, the 1850s, but I know the 1800s. So it was created over 150 years ago. Um, and it's based entirely on statistics. And statistics do not paint an accurate picture of humanity in most cases. And how you use and portray those statistics are going to influence everything. And the BMI is just not useful for a number of reasons. In the 1800s, there was less food excess, so people weren't eating as much as we are now. The foods were very different. The economic statuses and socioeconomic statuses have all switched around since then, and we don't know where it's standing. There's no reason that the BMI still exists today and is being used. And so that is like the first thing that you can do to fight fat phobia is know your science and start spreading the actual accurate science. And I think that a lot of that has to do with challenging folks on what they think they know, which is really hard. But I think that the second thing is if you have a hard time challenging folks on science or you're not very science literate, that's fine, because it also comes back to let people have their body autonomy. Like, people are allowed to be fat and you don't have to comment on it, you don't have to say anything. And I have this conversation with a lot of my friends, and a lot of my family, which is where a lot of the fat phobia in my life comes from, is my family, and growing up with it. And it's gotten better in recent years, but it got to the point where with my mother, I would hang up on her if she ever asked me about my weight. I told her, you ask me about my weight and I will hang up on you. And I had to hang up on her about 3 times before she stopped bringing it up. Um, and she would bring it up in person still, and I finally just like lost it one day, and I was like, why does this even matter? It's not even affecting my life. It's never affected my life. I've been fat for this long and it hasn't changed. Why is this happening? And so she finally got the message, and now we don't even talk about it anymore, unless it is me talking about it in support of fellow fat folks, or berating her for saying something really insensitive. So it's hard, but you have to persist. That is the best thing that you can do. There's also some other things. If you are in any kind of position of power and making decisions, think about how a fat person might move through a space. For me, any type of chair that has armrests, I probably won't fit in those chairs. I'm just too big. I have very wide hips. I have always been that way. And so that's been something that I tell people. I'm like, oh, well, if you're thinking about a new office space, you should think about not these chairs. And think about how much weight a chair can handle. Because if you are inviting people over to your cookout or whatever, and all you have are those flimsy white chairs, if you have a bigger friend, they're going to have a hard time fitting into those chairs and staying stable in those chairs. Have another option for them. And also, like, just be ready for people to have more weight about them in general. One of the other things that's pretty common is traveling with fat folks can be really hard because airlines can charge us for two seats if if the attendants are having a bad day and they're like, you don't quite fit in this seat, we're just going to charge you for the one next to you because you're clearly taking up that space. And it doesn't matter if you're on the aisle seat or if there's someone next to you or not. It's really just a decision. And so if you're in a position of power, start standardizing those practices in some way that benefits fat folks as well as thin folks. Um, and don't make it about don't leave it up to an individual's choice, because those biases that occur around fatness are baked into every part of our culture. I have not watched a movie to this day in my memory. I have not watched a movie that did not have at least one fat joke, except for, I think it was the Ghostbusters movie that was very recently made with Melissa McCarthy, and the all-female cast. That did not have one fat joke in it, and I was so amazed that that happened.
Yeah, I mean,
So yeah,
what's that test that you do to see if
the
there's
Bechdel
the
test.
Bechdel test, if there's two women in a room and they're having a conversation and it's not about a man. That should be like another standard of
Yeah.
testing cinema and TV shows. Like, are they like, even if this is a movie about like justice and equality, are they still cracking fat jokes? And like, and
Yeah.
speaking of media, you brought up something last time that I feel like we didn't touch on as much as we should have. And it's just like, it is perpetuating negative negative stereotypes about bodies in movies, because you said there is never ever in movies you never see like a fat person as the love interest, or if they do, it's like in a weird like, I have a mental disability, like in Shallow Hal. Like, it's just like there's never like, I don't know, there's like one show on CBS where it's like a fat couple and it looks just like a King of Queens ripoff, except for they're both fat this time. And it's just like,
Right.
it is that just like perpetuating just like fat being unattractive by not putting those sorts of situations in cinema.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's one of those situations that I always hate is there is a fat person in a movie who is a really sincere character but never has a love interest or never talks about anybody having a crush on them or anything. And so even you mentioned King of Queens specifically, both of those characters are fat characters. So if you do have someone who's fat in a happy relationship, their partner is also fat, which just perpetuates this idea that is like the separating of body types, or the segregation of body types, although I hate to use that word because we can't equate fat advocacy and race
Yeah.
advocacy. But so just to be clear on that, um, but you never have like a fat main character who isn't also funny or um, is has a serious love interest that almost never happens. And I thought of one. There is one example of a larger character, although I don't know if I would call her fat in the same way. She again falls under that like kind of acceptably fat umbrella term, which is in Legally Blonde. The sidekick in that has like a very serious love interest who is a very conventionally attractive man who also falls for her.
Yeah.
And that's so rare that I can think of it off the top of my head even. Um, and just the portrayal of fat people in general is usually seen as a joke, and if it's not, it's seen as an indicator of struggle. So I always think of this when we talk about hero movies. So specifically in the Avengers, Thor gained weight when he was depressed, and it was a symbol of his struggle and how he was dealing with the loss and PTSD, etc. So then it just became a tool, and it was commented on a number of times. And I have heard people say, well, it's the first time a superhero's looked like me. And so I do want to acknowledge that, like, sometimes that can be good. that you have some diversity in character, but what we need is diversity in a healthier and more well-rounded way. Because on the contrast to Thor and how that helped people, you have movies like Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, where Peter B. Parker has been going through depression and has gained some weight, and every character that meets him comments on it in a really like disparaging way. And they say, well, oh, he's wearing sweatpants and all this other stuff. And sometimes I look at that and I'm like, well, sometimes sweatpants are the only pants that I can find that fit because shopping for someone who's fat is really expensive because you have to go to Torrid or Lane Bryant or XL Men or whatever. Um, and so, in that way, I think that that is still perpetuating harm. And it's one of the ways that we can see that there's not a double standard there, basically. That men do struggle with body image and things like that. And that's still, it's also part of the conversation. And it's a very important part of the conversation, too.
Yeah, what we need a fat superhero whose superpower doesn't revolve around their fat.
Yeah,
Like,
basically.
and because
Yeah.
there's a lot of fat supervillains, and it's just playing into that like whole like fat cat, fat equals bad sort of thing. And for some reason, it's
Mm-hmm.
a huge thing is effeminate Southern men too. I don't know what that's about, but my nephews were watching the Boss Baby, and like I love Gravity Falls, but I don't know why Gideon has to be a fat, effeminate Southern gentleman.
You know, that's a good point that I had not realized. And I think that that might come down to those are one of the acceptably fat categories is Southern effeminate men being fat. And so it's, you can have a fat character, but it's going to fall under this trope because then it's acceptable and palatable for other people. And that's the other thing is like, I'm really glad that they're like movies like Ghostbusters and whatnot have had characters that aren't all about food. But I would also love a fat character to love food. Like I'm a fat person, I love food. Can I see myself on, you know, in a way that isn't the butt of every joke? Like, can I just like food? Is that okay? And so it's one of those things where like we have to, and I see this a lot in a lot of different advocacies, we have to fight for any type of representation. So being picky about representation is hard, but it's still really important. So it's not, we can't just go with the representation that's best. We have to take what we can get right now, but also we can work for better. And why aren't we doing that? And the reason is usually social norms.
Yeah, yeah, social norms just blow. And just
They
gonna
are. So be an advocate and break social norms. That is Uncle Indigo's advice for today.
yeah, and that should be like a subtitle of my chaos or my chaos, my podcast. I don't know where the word chaos just came out. Too many white claws. Uh, but yeah, it should just be
Yeah, the
like
podcast.
fuck your normal. um.
Yeah.
All right, so we have I think about like 15 minutes until the hour. What we should talk about is
Okay.
like, just what people can do in their everyday life because odds are you have a fat friend. And I want to talk about like because we had this conversation the last time we talked and it was a good one because you can't judge health based on appearance because like my boy D, he's like this 400-pound dude and he benches 500 pounds and he's this big old black dude who wears a kilt and like participates in the Highlander games and shit. And he's healthy as fuck. But if you looked at him, you'd be like, damn, that is a huge dude. And then I talked about my friend who like he had found a lady and he had gotten really happy and he put on a bunch of weight because he was happy and he found the love of his life. And years later we see him and he's really skinny, like he's lost a lot of weight and we're just like, oh wow, like you look great, Mikhail, like you've really lost a lot of weight, you look great. And come to find out like he had been, oh, did I say his name out loud? I should probably edit that out if I did. Like you look great. And he like comes to find out that he has cancer. He has bone marrow cancer, and he, like, thank God he fought it and he beat it. Like, it was because bone marrow cancer is one of the fucking hardest ones to beat, from what I understand. And it's just like, you really just got to watch what you say to people, because like
Mhm.
telling him like, hey man, you look great, is probably just a reminder of just like, oh yeah, chemotherapy is slowly killing me.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's like that. You make a really great point there. First, I'm going to need an introduction to that first friend you mentioned who wears a kilt.
You would love D. He's up in Ohio right now, but I'll hit you two up for sure.
Sweet. Um, and but the point that you make is just basically don't comment on people's weight. There are so many ways to compliment someone that don't have anything to do with appearance. And there, you can say like, "Oh, you look great," or "That's a good color," or "You really chose an excellent outfit." And then you don't even have to like compliment anything about their physical being. You can say like, "I'm glad you're here. It's good to see you." There's all kinds of things, and just like you said, you're never going to know what someone's going through. So someone who gained a bunch of weight could, it could be for a positive reason, it could be for a negative reason. People who lose weight, it's the same thing. And even down to the point for me where when someone says, I have been trying to lose weight and I've been successful, I don't even say, oh, well, good job or whatever. I say, I'm glad you reached that goal, because it makes it about the goal and what they did to reach that versus their actual weight. Um, so I don't even like complimenting people who have lost weight. I'd be like, oh, you look great. I just honestly, I have asked before of like people say, well, oh, I've lost like 20 pounds. And I go, well, were you trying? And this kind of comes into, I have my own story around that. I ended up losing a lot of weight the first time I went to Colorado because I was suddenly hiking all the time and having to do a lot of manual labor and things like that. And I lost a ring because my fingers were suddenly a different size than my ring was. And I was really mad about it. And people were like, oh man, you lost weight. And I'm like, yeah, I know. I'm pissed about it. And they were like, what are you talking about? And so then I have to explain that. And so, in your day to day life, just like figure out how to not make things about appearance in general, and be really clear with people. Don't be afraid to ask, like, if someone says, oh, I lost a bunch of weight, or if they are gaining weight, it's okay to say, like, hey, are you going through something? But you should have more justification than just their appearance. You should notice patterns in people around you, if you're going to ask about change in those patterns. For example, if you notice that one of your friends has gained a bunch of weight, that's fine. If you notice that they've gained a bunch of weight and now they're not wearing makeup, but they used to always wear makeup, or their hair has been cut or is growing longer and they always keep it trimmed, like, you should notice that and you should ask, how they're doing. And I would say the other thing is never approach people with the idea that you know about their health better than they do or better than a doctor does. Um, and if someone needs support, you just support them. I've often asked my friends, I'm like, hey, I need you to hype me up. I'm about to go to the doctors. I know they're going to tell me to lose weight. I need you to like tell me to tell them to fuck off. Like, help me through that process because that is a position of power. Um, and talk to your friends about it. That's like the best thing that I always say is advocacy starts at home.
Yeah, and something, yeah, like the dick move I was talking about with you last time is just like, this is just me not knowing any better. This is probably 4 5 years ago. But another buddy of
Mm-hmm.
mine, another one of my best friends in the whole world, like, just we were drinking together and we were talking about weight, and it's just like, I had asked you, I'll ask you again, even though I know the answer, but it was such a good answer, and now there's pressure on you, so it better be good. Um, like, I had talked to him. I'm sorry, too much pressure. I had talked to him.
I don't remember what I said, so.
Yeah. Well, you're fine. We were talking, we were drinking, and I was just like, man, like, I just really love you as a friend. Like, I really love you, and I want to make sure that you live as long as I do. And it's just, and then that came into the conversation of just like, I just worry about your weight. And now you go into detail about how much of a dick move that is to do.
Yeah, so that was a dick move, and it's one of those things that like it was a dick move, and you were very implicit about your intentions. Of this came from a place of love, and that is like one of the hardest things about being fat is how much advice comes from a place of love and like, well, we just want you to live longer, we just want you to have a healthier life, and all this other stuff. And first of all, I do not want to live forever. I am not one of those people who's like seeking immortality in any way, shape, or form. I hope that I live to a healthy age and then I die kind of quietly in a bed. And you know, if I outlive all you fuckers, great. And if I don't, fine. Then I don't have to watch you die. Great. Like there are no bad choices there. um, but it's one of those things of like you never know what someone might be going through around those things, and so you're gonna come off as a dick if you mention stuff like that. Um, and often it also does come back to how are you going to support someone if you think that someone should lose weight. Are you going to personally plan their meals and pay for their groceries and pay for their gym membership and do their job so that they have time to go to the gym if that's part of your like health plan for them? So everybody comes up with this advice, and I would say that if you really love your friends and you want them to live healthy lives, then figure out how you can be a healthy influence in their lives. And that often doesn't mean going to the gym with them. It often means having emotional conversations with them. And everybody avoids emotional conversations.
Yeah. Another big thing of counterculture media is
Yes.
confronting people and making them have emotional conversations with me. But it's also
Yes.
it's also something I've come into contact with is just like not everybody is ready to have emotional conversations, that or not everybody wants to have emotional conversations all the time. Like that's something I'm really fucking struggling with right now because I'm just like, I just want to talk about my feelings and magic and therapy. And everyone's just like, can we just watch the fucking football game? God damn it, Alex.
Well, hey man, you know how to get a hold of me. I'm always down for emotional conversations.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Well, and this also comes into that's another big thing about weight is that everybody I know who has been fat or is fat or whatever has feelings about it. It's gonna be an emotional conversation. And if you don't want to have an emotional conversation about fatness, then don't give us advice about being fat. Like it's tied so inherently to emotions, but you're going to avoid the actual important part of that conversation. And that just doesn't make sense to me at all. And I had another point that I was thinking about when I said that, and then I got distracted.
It's okay. That looks like really tasty hot chocolate tequila.
It is very delicious. I'm very pleased. Um,
So
it
to
had to do with emotions and being and oh, that's the other thing. Here's another thing that is the biggest piece of advice that I can give someone, and that is don't talk about your diet with your fat friends. Your fat friends do not want to hear about how you don't want to look like them. Nobody wants to hear that. So don't talk about your diets with your fat friends. Keep that food talk to yourself, and don't like fuss over a restaurant menu and be like, well, this one has like 600 calories, so I'm going to go with the one that has 500 calories. Like, we don't want to hear it. Just order your fucking food and eat your goddamn fries, Karen. Like, it's fucking fine. Um, and that also ties into the whole morality of food, which people are like, oh, well, I'm going to be bad and have like a slice of cake. It's it's cake. It's going to nourish your body. It has sugars that your body will use for energy. It has fats that your body will use to insulate itself. Just eat the cake and it's fine, and you don't have to comment about it. And don't do that for anybody else either. Don't say like, oh, well, you know, this is our we walked up the mountain or we went for a hike or whatever, so now we can go and eat all the noodles we want or shit like that. Like, I don't care. I was going to eat all those noodles regardless of whether I hiked a mountain.
Yeah.
So,
Something else that I heard that like I didn't think about or comprehend was just like, just keep your fat friends in mind when you're asking them. Like, it's not so relevant right now because the world's fucking closed, but like, just keep your fat friends in mind when you're doing activities like, hey, like, we're gonna go out to eat together once restaurants are open again. Just like, think about, if you've eaten there before, think about the lobby or like the dine in your mind. Like, is my fat friend going to be able to find a comfortable place to sit, or are we going to
yeah.
walk in? It's going to be awkward because like we have to like sit at a special table, or like we have to wait for a booth. It's just like, there's just little things you can do to like just make it so that, because being a fat person is hard. Just like, try to keep things in mind of little things you can do to make their life a little bit easier.
Yeah. And I think that that brings up something that we haven't touched on yet, which is actually the actual oppression of fat people. We were somehow more organized the last time, and despite having that to go off of, we're less organized this time, which I think is excellent. Um, but like, I do want to talk about how fat people are actually oppressed in our society, and like, and I've mentioned a lot of this just earlier in the podcast, but things like seats not holding our weight, um, armrests digging into us, and things not being built with fat folks in mind. An example that I always bring up is in one of my lecture halls in college. The desks that flipped up from the armrest and folded down either dug into my stomach, sat on top of my stomach, and thus weren't level, or I just didn't fit in them comfortably anyway. And so I ended up having to use a trash can as a desk. I would put my notebook on top of the trash can hole and just right on top of the notebook. And that was what I had to do because I didn't fit anywhere else. And as a result, I ended up having to be at the front of the classroom every time. And if I was late and someone took my spot that I like always sat in, I would either have to go up and say like, "Hey, there's a specific reason I have to move, like sit here," and then explain the whole situation, which is awkward for everybody, or I'd have to sit somewhere else and not have a desk. On top of that, a lot of places that sell clothing that I can wear are more expensive because they're specialty shops. I would love to be able to thrift clothes. It's really hard for me. I cannot find anything that fits in a thrift store because once someone who is fat finds a piece of clothing that works for them, they don't tend to want to give it away. We use our clothing until it's full of holes. In addition to that, people who go to thrift stores and say, I'm going to buy this size 20 dress and sew it down to my size 4 body because it's nice and hip and trendy and look at me recycle, I hate that because that's a fat person's dress and they need that to be there so they can afford to buy clothes that day. Um, and so that's a whole thing. And in addition to that, you talked about it yourself, the abuse that gets hurled at fat folks. And I bring up a very specific instance of this. Gillette, the razor company, put up an ad, and it was just a fat woman on a beach, and she was just happy. She was just in this very elated pose, and the ad was like, "We want to help you feel like your best self, no matter how much of you there is," or something to that effect. And the amount of absolute venom and vitriol that people had in the comments under that ad was heartbreaking. There were people who were like, she's unhealthy, she's gonna die, she deserves to die because she's so unhealthy.
Hello? Did I lose you?
Fat rolls, that's disgusting. I don't want to see this. And it's just like, you have to hide. Like, that is, you hide your fat, and that is the way to be acceptably fat.
Yeah. Yeah, like, it's, fat is synonymous with bad. And it comes
Yes.
like full circle, bringing it back to like the beginning of the podcast, like the beginning of the episode. It's just like, it started to be a bad thing because it was people hoarding resources. And out of that came like the fat cat, which is the anti-hero, the bad guy. And it's just like there just needs
Yep.
to be, I don't know, there just needs to be more conversations like this where it's just like, hey, the more you talk shit about fat people, the more you talk shit about yourself because you're not even a fat person, but because feel a little bit you feel ashamed of yourself, or you feel bad because you gained weight, kind of is just like a dick move that needs to stop. I mean, like, whatever makes you happy, like, you're like, someone's bodily autonomy is very much the same of like, I feel my best when I'm skinny and fit and have muscle mass. Like, that's fucking way cool for you, but at the same time it's like that shouldn't be it. Like, you should just be like, I don't know, like, I think it's just beautiful, like, to talk to fat people who are happy about being fat, because like
Yeah.
since we had our last conversation, like, I'm struggling a little bit with like the COVID-15, and just like when I look in the mirror I'm just like, man, I'm fat, this sucks. But like the last time we talked, like when we had this whole conversation, I was just like, every time I look in the mirror now it's just like, I'm still hot as fuck, like, I don't give a shit.
Exactly. And solid agree. You're hot as fuck, bro. Um, and so one of the other things that I think that people can do is start examining, and this goes for all types of advocacy that I ever engage in, is look at your own patterns. Because if you notice that all of a sudden you are swiping left on Tinder for anybody who's a little bit fat, that's a pattern. And you can't necessarily control who you're attracted to, but you can look at the patterns in your life and see where they come from. Um, in addition to that, one of the things that I hate having to make this argument because fat people just deserve respect because they're people. But if you need a reason to like help people who aren't fat, one of the most searched terms on Pornhub has always been BBW, big beautiful women. And people feel like they have to hide their love of fat people as a result of how this society just hates fat people and thinks that they don't deserve love in any form. So if we do have more fat advocacy, there's more people who are free to say, like, this is what I love. And isn't that excellent? Shouldn't we be free to love whatever we love?
Yeah, I mean, and that's like a huge emerging topic and trend too, like throwback to the transgender episode. It's just like, we're hopefully the dawning of the age of Aquarius will all just be having orgies one day and everything will be copacetic. But you're right, it's just like, we need to, I don't know, just be open and honest. It shouldn't be a shameful thing, even though fucking normal stupid shit.
Yeah.
Yep.
Normal is useless. Be
Normal.
fat, be awesome, be sexy.
Yeah, let's all be fat and weird together. I'm gonna put that on a t-shirt.
Yes. I'll do the art for it.
All right. All right, well, thank you so much for talking to me. I'm gonna like not hang up, but press unrecord, stop the recording, and me and you can get more
Yes.
drunk and shoot the shit. Are you down?
Yeah, I'm super down.
All right, cool. Well, thank you, listeners, for listening to Counterculture Media. If you have any comments or just want to talk about things, I'll figure out how to do all this eventually. Until then, I should think of a catchphrase.